My name is Cinnamon, and I'm with Ronneng Consulting. Ronneng is the National Tribal Technical Assistance Provider working with the Office on Violence Against Women. And we offer a variety of trainings, consultations, either on-site or one-on-one, through email and phone calls. We provide assistance for transitional housing in these different ways. And one is through our webinar series. We can also help with policies, education, community outreach, and developing or enhancing services for victims. Thank you so much for joining us today for this webinar. Ronneng's vision is to strengthen tribal programs and Native organizations' ability to develop and enhance local responses to address and prevent domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking. In this effort, Ronneng is committed to building the leadership of Indigenous women, defining and guiding its work from traditions, values that carry strength and essence of Native women while recognizing that we must work across our community to prevent everyone back into our circle of life. So, like I said, my name is Cinnamon Ronneng, and I'm a member of B'day Dakota tribe out of Minnesota. And I've been doing this work since 2001. Started out as a sexual assault advocate, had the opportunity to participate in a pilot project and coordinate the sexual assault response team on a local basis, and worked in tribal shelter as well as other crisis response centers before coming here to Ronneng in 2010. So thank you again for joining us today. Our webinar is on decolonizing trauma work. When I first started the work back in 2001, there wasn't a whole lot of Native-specific resources or materials to address the domestic violence or sexual assault. And so I'm happy to say we've come a long ways across the United States and up in Alaska, building our resources. And today is part of that building our resources. Decolonizing trauma work, Raquel is going to start us off today, but it's about housing programs to overlook the importance of board services and focus on a few mainstream options for tenants. This webinar will provide an overview on the importance of cultural and traditional approach to working with survivors of violence while they're in a housing program, Indigenous perspectives on healing, such as resiliency, connectedness, and the importance of community, and how to offer traditionally, culturally appropriate methods of healing will be discussed today. So welcome and thank you, and I want to introduce Raquel.
Hi everyone, my name is Raquel DeHerrera and I'm the Special Projects Coordinator for Ronneng Consulting. So I work on various projects, whether that's doing research or just being support. And right now I'm doing a housing project. So, and before we start this webinar, I just wanted to acknowledge a book that has guided us for this webinar. It's called Decolonizing Trauma Work, Indigenous Stories and Strategies by Ronneng Linklater. It's an amazing book and offers a lot of information and resources. We will type the title in the text box for you to have. It's a great resource to further your trauma work and decolonizing that. So as Cinnamon stated, today we're going to talk about trauma and specifically how it pertains to our program participants in transitional housing programs. We will discuss Indigenous forms of healing that we as advocates can offer and why it's important to offer those things. Excuse excuse me, sorry, I have a little cold, so if I clear my throat, that's why. But if at any time you have questions or comments, feel free to type them into the text box. We'll check and answer them periodically. And so to start off, the next slide, we're going to talk about a little more about the statistics aspect. It's important to realize that there are quite a large number of American Indian Alaska Native people living in cities off reservations, pueblos, Alaska villages. And so if you are a program off of the reservation or in an urban city, it's still important, if not, as important to offer culturally specific resources for healing. There are about 100,000 people living in California, Arizona, New Mexico, in these big urban cities. And so according to the National Alliance to End Homelessness, domestic violence is the immediate cause of homelessness for many women. And DomesticShelters.org even furthers that by stating that 50% of all women who are experiencing homelessness report that domestic violence was the immediate cause of their homelessness. And more than 1 in 2 American Indian Alaska Native women, and that comes to about 55.5%, have experienced physical violence by intimate partners in their last lifetime. The United States Interagency Council on Homelessness put out a report on homelessness among American Indians, Alaska Natives, and Native Hawaiians, and explained that even though Indigenous people of America make up only 1.2% of the national population, 4% of all sheltered homeless people, and 4.8% of all sheltered homeless families who self-identify as Native American or Alaska Native are homeless. This report also emphasizes that even though there are obstacles such as violence and poverty, we all have traditions that can support resiliency and recovery. And so we're going to talk about trauma first. I think it's important if we're going to decolonize trauma, we need to kind of understand how we are defining trauma. According to Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, trauma refers to experiences that cause intense physical and psychological stress reactions. So this can be a single event, multiple events, or a set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's physical, social, emotional, and spiritual well-being. And so these can be multiple events, not just one event, or it could be one event. So it's, the frequency is impacted or impacts trauma, severity of the trauma or the experience. And so in this webinar, we're going to talk about domestic violence and that experience and how that impacts program participants in transitional housing programs. Along with other traumatic events such as homelessness, poverty, substance abuse, sexual violence, trafficking, oppression, and racism, along with domestic violence, can affect the severity of trauma when working with Native women in transitional housing programs. And I think it's important to emphasize an Indigenous perspective on trauma as being a state of being imbalanced and not living in harmony or harmoniously. So mainstream information on trauma can be helpful, but it can also be re-traumatizing. Most of the time it's backed up by Western research, Western ideology, which is, values that the Western culture decides to conduct research. So that can label Native victims as problematic and create a negative impact when seeking help because they often miss the part on traditional healing methods. And so we'll go into further on traditional healing and Indigenous healing options and how you can promote that in your transitional housing program. So we just wanted to touch on trauma. And so when talking about trauma and in Native communities, it's important and critical to recognize historical trauma, which is also known as intergenerational trauma, multi-generational trauma, transgeneration trauma. This trauma comes from, I would say, colonization. And I'm defining colonization. Wikipedia, I think, defined it best, and it was the best definition that I have found for myself. But it's an ongoing process by which a central system of power dominates the surrounding land and its components, and in this case, its people. So the methods in which early Europeans colonized were through religion, their missionaries, biological warfare, disease-infested blankets, and then as we see, 1800s and on, even to mid-1900s, we had mass genocide, massacres such as Wounded Knee, Sand Creek Massacre, where a mass amount of people were killed. We also, other forms of colonization were forced assimilation. So by assimilation, that means fitting into the dominant, which would be the colonizer's culture. And that was forced. So that was forced by boarding schools where children were either kidnapped or somehow taken from their families and put into boarding schools. They had to cut their hair, speak English. They couldn't speak their language. They had to learn in American schools. So they learned, American stories, not their stories, their culture stories. So through this process, Native knowledge was harder to get passed down from generation to generation. Up until 1972, Native people weren't allowed to practice their own religion. And so another form of colonization is forced relocation and removal of our homelands. We had to farm our land the way that America wanted us to farm our lands. And we had to put up fences, and if we didn't do those things, our lands would be taken away and allotted to other non-Native people. So that's why we have the allotment. Reservations tend to look like a checkered board. All the way down to forced sterilization and taking children of single Native women in the 70s. These are all forms of colonization. I especially want to talk about the forced relocation of our homelands, because women who have experienced domestic violence and have to leave their homes, that can be a trigger or even re-traumatizing, therefore exasperating the trauma from domestic violence. That's something that we need to consider when talking about removal, relocation, historical trauma, and the trauma from domestic violence. Anything you wanted to add?
Well, this is Cinnamon, and I think it's just important to make that connection of historical trauma and how it impacts us today and how it affects who we are, but it also affects the work that we do. It affects how we heal ourselves and our own traumas, and how we help our sisters and their families to support and heal themselves as well. So there is a large connection there between then and now. And the other piece that I wanted to acknowledge was this was something that didn't just happen. It wasn't a one-time occurrence. It's something that happened over a period of time. And I think just as an Indian woman, in thinking about a big piece of who we are is the stories that we share, the stories that our grandmothers shared with us and our grandfathers shared with us. Those are things that helped us to get through the difficult times the challenging times in our life as well, the way they lived. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we move forward. But I think in talking about historical trauma, it's important to make that connection, and that it happened over many, many years, and many laws and regulations that were put onto tribes really confined them, and they had to find alternative ways to heal, alternative ways to feed their family and get their basic needs met. So in talking about housing, making sure that we have those basic needs met is a vital piece of our healing process as well.
And absolutely, I think Cinnamon makes a good point that this was a period of time. It didn't happen as a one-time event. And it's also, I think, talking about decolonizing trauma, even ways that we treat, and treat is even a word that's very, I think healing is the best word. How we heal trauma can be very westernized and can also promote colonization in a way. So that's why we're hoping that to emphasize the importance of traditional healing, those stories. Historical trauma is passed down through generation after generation. So genetically, it's just passed down. So that is important to understand.
Is there any comments or questions at this point? And we'll stop periodically to ask if there's any questions or comments. In the meantime, feel free to use the chat box, and know that all of the participants and presenters can see that.
And so when we talk about colonization, there's also decolonization. And what does that mean necessarily? I found a really good quote. It was decolonizing essentially means to start thinking like an Indian. So that means how we as Native people know what we know. What are our values? How do we walk through this world and connect with our community? And how is it emphasized that we are caretakers for all living things? How do we relate and maintain relationships within our community? So that's an important piece. I don't know if you want to add.
Well, when you started talking about the topic for this, I'm like, what does that mean, decolonizing? And it's like, well, it's who we are, it's what we do, and what comes natural to us. And sometimes when you're in mainstream, we all come from different geographic areas as well. So sometimes when you're in mainstream, whether you're in a rural location or urban location, like Raquel mentioned, 80% of American Indians are living in larger cities, in metropolitan areas, and off reservations. So we're moving around as well, and so we learn different things as we move forward. And Raquel hit it right on the head. Decolonizing is really the core of our Indian self-being and who we are as Native people. And there's some common threads that we have. There's some common traits that we have across the board as far as being Indian. And again, we'll talk about that shortly here in a moment. But
yeah, and I think it's important to know that our communities and societies had their own effective way of functioning. We had our own way in which we governed our communities. Some, if not most, were matrilineal. So everything was passed down through the mother side of the family. The home belonged to the mom. Children were taken care of by the mother side of the family. And, in some Native communities, the brother acted as the father figure and did the raising of children. The husband would move into his wife's camp or would stay with his wife's mother or wife's family, side of the family. So it's very matrilineal. And through colonization, those values were disrupted. The Western America tends to be patriarchal, tends to be individualistic, and so our collective identity and values were disrupted through colonization. So decolonization just means to come back to those values of supporting each other in the community, sharing roles, sharing the responsibility of taking care of each other. So in transitional housing programs, that's just something to be mindful of, that we take care of each other, and we're here to help heal. So,
well, and I was thinking, back in 2001 and 2002, when I was searching out Native-specific materials on domestic violence and sexual assault, and wasn't finding anything, I really had to think, okay, I have this moment, I'm in this position where I'm able to reach out and help to guide my sisters and their families through a horrible time in their life. And how is that different? How is it different than mainstream? And I really had to think hard about what those differences were. And one of them that stuck out to me right away was the difference of how we treat our children, where we all take care of the children. If we're in a group setting, the children are running and playing and everyone is watching them and taking care of them. In mainstream, it's more secluded, it's more separated. So those sorts of things are things that stuck out to me a little bit more. And this is still, we're still growing, we're still coming together as a whole community across the nation. And so even today and through our webinar series, sharing is a piece of it. We're sharing our knowledge, and we want you to share your knowledge and what's going on in your community and what you are seeing, or what's working for you, what may not be working for you. And that's a big piece of the values that we have, is sharing our knowledge.
Absolutely. I think sharing knowledge is an important piece in American Indian culture. We share what we know, the wisdom that we have. You share it with everyone. So, and I think it's important, despite efforts of termination and assimilation, our relatives prayed and had ceremonies, and even if they were forced underground, they still had those ceremonies. And we're still here, thriving, and that shows that our Indigenous ways of healing does create, resiliency, does promote resiliency as a people. So it's important that we utilize that and offer those resources. And so when we talk about decolonizing trauma, a colonized trauma response in transitional housing can be authoritative, punitive, individualistic, and sometimes re-traumatizing because it's not culturally responsive. There's more labeling, there's more treatment, and so as we decolonize trauma response in transitional housing, it's good to focus on interconnectedness. Actually listen to, the program participants, and, if you see that they're tired and hungry, offer food or talk over food, and, promote just feeling connected instead of a patient or a client and someone who is there just because that's their job. Connectedness really is healing in all of it in itself. And so collective rather than individualistic, and we're going to talk about this more at the end of this PowerPoint, but it's important as a community, not just the transitional housing program, but to collaborate with other community programs or partnerships and just create that community of doing better for members of society. And it focuses on healing rather than treatment or, and belongingness. Western forms of healing could reinforce traumatic experiences. I think traditional healing brings people back into their community and creates a space where connectedness can happen, where people can feel like they do belong and that they are worth something. I think domestic violence can diminish someone's self-esteem and self-worth, and so I think that in a more traditional approach, we can lift that person up and show them that they are valued, that they do have worth. So,
well, and I think, Raquel, when we talk about some of those differences, we look at as advocates, whether it's doing crisis work or whether it's working in a shelter or transitional housing, that we're supportive of them and our relationship is mutually determined, that we're not doing case management work, which is mainstream response, where it might be punitive and when you start looking at it from that aspect, some of the self-disclosures might be limited, and you're not going to be able to help that individual or their families as much as you can if they're not disclosing some of their challenges for you or to you. And when we look at traditional response, it's also an individual. We look at them as they are being their own experts, and they're not being told what to do. We're guiding them, we're informing them, and we're supporting them along the way. And we're helping them to maintain their own balance within their life.
And I think that's important. According to Johnston in her article, Native American Traditional and Alternative Medicine, she does state that traditional healing supports and brings awareness of self-determination, autonomy, social justice, and resistance to oppression. So it does promote a sense of being an expert in their own life, being in control of their own life. And I know that sometimes funding, it can be hard to, if you have things that you have to do due to funding. There are little ways that we can go about being as decolonized as we can, and that just comes to policies and protocols. An example, we worked on a policy and protocol where we put in their tribe's values, and that was a way that we could do that, making it more indigenous and more healing. If you see that somebody is having a hard time with, if you have goals that you have in your transitional housing program and they're having a hard time, meeting that goal, and, instead of taking it as an authoritative approach or a punitive approach, you can look at it as, did I make this goal for them? Is this something that's important to them? And maybe, go back to that and ask them, make them the leading person in their life instead of saying, well, you didn't do this, so we can't do this, or, so just kind of those little things where you can just reconnect. And I think being connected to the people that you're working with, are working for, I think that promotes healing and trust. I think that historically, Western institutions such as schools, government, hospitals, and counseling. I think they can be re-traumatizing because of the historical implications, the distrust that there is. So, I think it's important to build those relationships and also to acknowledge that there are traditional ways to heal. And when you offer those, you are acknowledging that identity of that person and validating them. And I think that's healing. That's a step to healing and autonomy. So.
Well, and I think about, Raquel, the impact of the crimes that the participants that you're working with have survived, whether it's sexual assault or domestic violence, stalking, trafficking, all of these horrific crimes that have been committed against them and how they're healing. So I know for myself that when something small happens throughout my day that might have a negative impact on me, how it impacts me can vary. So when you have this crime that's committed against you that has impacted your spirit, it impacts the way you are thinking and reasoning and problem solving and living life day to day, it's a long-term effect, and it's life-changing, and it changes who you are. It changes how your family is functioning, how your friends and extended family are responding to you. So we have to consider what they've survived along the way. And if we think about transitional housing, we're looking at, 6 months to 2 years of support. That's a long period of time, but that's what's going to help them. And you can't lose sight that they've survived all these things, and that people heal in different ways, and it takes different amount of time that they do heal from it. So we want to remember that also. So along the way, we have to be gentle with helping the participants to move forward as well. So in talking about that, we're going to kind of move forward. Are there any questions at this point before we move forward? We're going to talk a little bit about traditional circle of healing and some of those cultural supports. I just want to give everyone a minute to unmute and ask a question or comment at this point. Okay, so we'll move forward. When we talk about traditional circle of healing, there's some universal values that we have listed up on the screen. Women and children are sacred. And I really want to look at what does that mean? What do some of those terms mean? And these are just universal ones. So what I'm encouraging all of you to do is to look at yourself, look at your area that you are in, and look at some of those traditional circle of healing. If you are not familiar with some of those traditions, then it's your responsibility as a tribal program to reach out to members in the community and find out what some of those traditions of healing are, and some of those cultural supports. It's your responsibility as a tribal program that's in a position to work with these survivors, to work with these families within our community.
I think it's important, to just offer these resources. Not everyone, some people are not traditional, some people are, have different religious viewpoints. So it is important to recognize that, but I think just to be aware and just to be mindful of those tribal traditional forms of healing is important to have, because sometimes, someone who, doesn't know that there are ceremonies or that there are certain medicines or stories, if that's offered, they might take that, and heal that way. Just to offer those choices is helpful and all. So.
Well, exactly, Raquel. And I know for myself, being a survivor, one of the things that helped me the most was learning about my history and being connected back to my tribe and learning some of those traditions, participating in ceremony, participating in some of the dance. And that was very, very healing for me personally. And so I know when I was working in shelter even, some of the women came in, and even though they lived there on the reservation, they didn't participate in some of those activities. And when it was offered and when we made it available, they, many of them, took advantage of it and were able to participate and begin their healing journey from that. And so many of you as transitional housing participants are in the process of developing your rules and policies, some of your procedures and your responses for the participants in your program, and you want to take into account how are you incorporating some of those traditions within your policies. How are you responding to them? And creating too many rules and too many policies can be a heavy burden. We have them in place for a reason. And there's some things we have to do because of our funding sources, right? But we also want to make sure that we're connecting with them in the process. And like Raquel said, we just finished up this last week helping a program with some of their policies, and they simply took their 7 grandfather teachings and implemented them as their policy, and that really covered, we talked about all of the challenges that they might have and how to address them, and most of what we needed to address was addressed under those teachings that they had. And when I think of decolonizing, one of the things that comes to mind is I hear the word client a lot. And to me, I look at that as when you think of someone who calls another person a client, that sends the message that that participant has to
I think it enforces definitely a power structure.
Yeah.
It establishes that somebody has a little bit more authority, but I also think going back to that connectedness, if you want to connect with the participant, and when you label them as a client, it really does take that relationship and separate it a little bit. And I know in some, I would say social work or counseling, I mean, you are supposed to detach yourself in a way. So I know that in not all fields of work, working with people and who are dealing with trauma, are experiencing trauma, it's going to be hard to do that. But I think language is a big piece of maybe in your paperwork you have to refer to them as a client, but when you're talking to them, maybe not talk to them as if they are a client, but just as somebody that you're having a conversation with. I think trust is a really good, is a value for a lot of our communities, trust. And so I think that if you connect with them and you build a relationship, you are building trust and kind of getting rid of that barrier of client and counselor or social worker, and you're just bringing the humanity back into it, I think.
Right, and so we want to treat them as an equal, as our sister. How would you want your sister or your family member to be treated? And that's how we really need to choose our language carefully, and also examine what we're doing and why we're doing it, how we're doing it, how are we responding. And kind of creating that space for growth for that participant. We want to recognize that help them to recognize that what they are doing will have an impact in a year from now or a year and a half from now. So taking that time to be on the same page and on the same level with them is going to be a vital piece of it. And when we think of it that way, that falls right within our values as Indian people.
And I think just going back to the universal tribal values, so, one of them is keeping children close. So how, as a transitional housing program, are you including and involving children and reinforcing the value that they're sacred? And how are we celebrating differences? And that can go into, how are we including two-spirited people, or how are we working with, how are we including everyone in our program? So I think we can lead on our values without having to worry about, are we meeting our funding requirements? I think you can throw those values in and kind of make them your own.
Right. Right. And I look at, again, I go back to that the top check mark there that says women and children are sacred, and I think about traditionally where I'm from, when women had babies, all of the women in the village gathered to help her, and they gathered to help take care of the other children, and so they formed a circle around her, and they supported her through that process, and giving her that space and that time that she needed to give birth. So it's just, we really want to think about how would we want to be treated in this process. So we know what the impact is of those crimes. We know some of those impacts, the legal, the financial, the physical impacts of crimes that are committed against us. So these participants have survived all that, and now they're in this transitional housing program, and how they are being treated is going to impact their spirit. And we want to know that what we are doing as responders, that we're nurturing their spirit, and we want to recognize that they're struggling through making really hard choices in their life, and recognize that their spirit has been impacted. And just remembering that we are, we're gentle and we're kind. There's a quote that I wanted to share with you, and I'm having a hard time reading the author, so forgive me. I think it says Severson and Berry, 2009. But it says, every day women survive physical or sexual violence. Some survive as a result of services they receive in the aftermath of the abuse. And so I just wanted to share that piece with you as we move forward. I thought it was a really powerful quote. And they are surviving as a result of the services they're receiving in the aftermath of their abuse. So I know I want to also recognize that through this process, through their healing process, they're going to have a difficult time in making choices. And so as service providers, we want to make sure that we are clear on their options. Sometimes we may have to repeat things or say things in different ways to help them to remember or to remind them about what their choices and options are, but always supporting whatever it is that they are choosing. And we think about some of the cultural supports. I'm going to just move forward for a minute. When we talk about cultural supports, these are just some of the cultural supports that survivors might have. But again, all of these cultural supports help them in their healing process. When we talked about historical trauma, when Raquel was talking about historical trauma, and I think about the cultural supports, and I'm thinking about how they survived those traumatic times, even with the land being taken. And she was talking about, fences being put up and land allotments and being put onto a reservation, and having boundaries. And knowing that at that time, some of those men in the communities were the hunters and fishermen and helped to provide the food for the rest of the village or the rest of their community, right? So how did that impact them if they weren't able to provide for their families and the communities and the villages as a whole? And you think about, you make that connection with how it impacted them, that was probably really challenging, really difficult for them to swallow, because they knew that it was their responsibility to get the rest of the village or the rest of the community that food to last through the winter, or for that particular season, or to pick the berries that may be on the other side of the fence, So I think when when we look at the crimes that are committed now and the participants that have survived it, how will those traditional cultural supports help them in their healing process? So some of those, the berry picking, the basket making. So in the South, they have a lot of clay potteries and clay bowls, where in the northern states there might be birch bark baskets that they've used. And when they do those cultural activities, so sitting down to make that pottery or sitting down to make those baskets is a time when the women would get together and they would create these things that they needed for their communities. But it was also a time where they connected with one another. They talked with one another. They supported one another. And we can't forget the laughter that happens as well. That laughter is very healing as well. And I think about all the laughter that we have as when we get into groups and our native sense of humor. And it's very different when I'm in a non-native group. So just make that connectedness. And I also think about, I don't know how many of you are familiar with white buffalo calf woman, but Lakota story talks about white buffalo calf woman and how she is sacred even in thought. So even in thought, women are sacred. And when I think about helping other women to understand that they really are sacred and why they are sacred, how they are sacred, I think of the white buffalo calf woman story and how she says, even in thought, women are to be respected.
I think Cinnamon makes a good point of, going back to those values. If you think about that story, it also emphasizes that not only do the women start feeling like, oh, you know what, we are sacred and we are valued, but that gets on out into the community. And that's a decolonizing effect where you start putting those values into society and into your communities. And so, men and children and families, they start seeing that as women are sacred. These are our values. It brings a sense of empowerment not only to, the woman living in a transitional housing program, but to society as a whole, that they are empowered, that they should, they are proud of their heritage and their cultural values. And I think that's a good step in decolonization. Once you realize that all of those values and that pridefulness and, laughter is very healing in a lot of our communities. I know in the Southwest, a lot of dances or, clowns were there to show just the humility of being what it means to be a human being. We're not perfect. We are not, we have things that we need to work on, but to laugh at those imperfections. And that's just a way of resiliency, to just have that laughter. That's a way we created our resiliency. So.
Well, and you think about creating a circle. A lot of us, many tribes, refer to a circle or a hoop, or, we think about creating a circle. So creating a circle brings you together as one with that other person as well. It requires faith. It develops that horizontal relationship where trust is really established. And I want to talk a little bit about some of those principles that we carry with us. But I also want to touch on some of the things that could break the circle. And that is when you share, one way of building trust is letting that person know that you're familiar with some of their challenges, but that you are not competing against them in any way, shape, or form. So, when you share in a way that you think your experience is more important or more extreme or more horrific or in any way, that's going to break that trust with them, that participant. They're going to think of you as a know-it-all. They're going to be distracted by that instead of respecting, hey, this person understands because we have a shared experience, right? Or that you might be too busy and not concentrating on their own issues, right? So when we think about some of the values honoring all of our relationships, we recognize the interconnectedness. We make sure families are identified by the victim. So if a family comes into your program and it is mom who might be the primary victim and her child, and maybe she's taking care of her nephew or her grandmother as well. It's important that we're including all of them. Who do they identify as their family? If they're identifying their nephew and their grandmother as their family, then we need to do that also. And that's some of the difference as well from mainstream programs to working in a traditional way. And we want to make sure that we're holistic, that you're working to address the complex needs that a survivor has. This will include the journey of personal healing towards living their lives as they desire, and letting them define what it is, helping them to identify and envision a life without violence is a vital piece of them surviving beyond our help.
And I think for cultural supports, just something to keep in mind, if you have a little care basket of traditional medicines, whether that's sage, sweetgrass, those are things that you can provide. You can offer, ceremonies. Hey, I know that there's this ceremony this weekend, or, just things like that to be culturally supportive, and going back to those, those activities that, are, before colonization, that making of baskets, whether it's birch bark or making bracelets or beadwork, things like that. That's healing. That's something that is culturally specific to that person. So just to offer those things, those supports, the kinship system, that's something, that family or, the community, that connection with the community. And we'll talk more about how important it is to connect and collaborate with other organizations, but, that's something that's big in our values. that, it's kind of that, I don't know if that's saying it takes a village to raise a child, but, it's that same, we lift each other up, we're a collective society. It's not, an individualistic, you take care of yourself. It's we are here for each other because the success of one person in our community is the success of everyone. So that's important to make sure that, you're providing resources for them to get involved in the community. That creates that sense of belongingness, that sense of empowerment and worthiness to know that, there's a community out there that they belong to and that they are welcome in. And I think that's important.
Thank you. Yeah. And I think of a friend that I have is a young woman, and she participates in poetry. They have a poetry program in their area. And we know that as Native people, we're very talented artists in many ways, whether it's pottery, basket making, singing, dancing, drumming, all of these things we have that are gifted to us. And poetry is one way of healing and expressing yourself as well. So I don't know if I want to put a question out if anyone would be willing to type in the chat. What are some things that you have in your area that you're thinking of that you may be able to share with others? I know some tribes are getting back to having community classes on beadwork, regalia making, like I said, getting together for different activities that they're doing throughout the year.
I think like up in northern Minnesota where they just the trees, the syrup or
maple
syrup, or even when they harvest the rice, that's something that you can do.
Wild ricing, the berry picking, those are all things. And I know for myself it was so helpful for me in my healing process. So I want to talk for a minute about creating that image of hope for families. And we talk a lot about how we can do that. And that's going to be a foundational piece for their healing process, for them to move forward in a long-term, envision long-term stability. We talk about honor, and what does that mean when you honor somebody? To me, I think about honor and respect is that we strive to do no harm, and that we're mindful in our verbal and our nonverbal language that we're using, that we're hearing them, we're listening to them, we're acknowledging what they're sharing with us, and we're acknowledging that they know what's best for them, and that we're honoring the choices that they're making along the way. And again, we only have that limited window of opportunity to work with the families, and we want to make sure that we're doing this in many ways, being treated with dignity and respect, and that we are guided by our teachings, respect, humility, truth, courage, love, wisdom, and honesty. So if we look at humility, for instance, we're expected to treat each other as we would our relatives and our sister. And we look at encouraging and supporting participants through their process and through their time that they're involved in our program. We look at truth. Truth is what determines how we walk through this world. And your truth might be different from another person's truth. We believe that we know what is best for ourselves, but this is also true for our participants, that they believe they know what's best for themselves. And they've survived to this point, right? They've made it this far. And so we want to continue to encourage and support them in making informed decisions. So that means we need to have our ducks in a row and make sure that we are familiar with our resources and that we're familiar with programs that might be helpful to those participants. And it's important to always speak the truth and speak it in a kind and gentle way. I know when I was doing direct services, I always told the women that I worked with, you know, I may not always have all the answers, and our options might not always be the best options, but they may be our only options. And I'm always going to be honest with you. I'm going to tell you, hey, you know, these are our options at this point. This is what we have to choose from. And then you examine those options with them. You talk about it with them. And we don't want to forget safety. And I'm going to talk about safety in just a moment as well. But safety is always, always priority. We talk about courage and bravery, and courage is the ability to have faith, to have persistence, and to have the strength in face of fear, pain, and stress, right? So we're going to encourage them and create an environment where women can see their own strengths so they can move past the pain. I'm not sure how many of you ever watched Dr. Oz or listened to Dr. Oz, but I'm a Dr. Oz fan. One day he had said, this was just a few weeks ago, I happened to be home, and he said, fear everything and rise, or forget everything and run. So face everything and rise, or forget everything and run. So the participants that you are working with, it's going to take a great amount of courage and bravery for them to face everything that they've survived and to rise, or fear and run, right? And we talk about love. Love is the foundation for all other teachings. Love yourself leads to finding your inner strength. It leads to respect for others, being truthful to yourself and others, and the ability to become the best you can be, not only for yourself, but those you are working with, right? So we want to help participants to love themselves, and that's one of the greatest gifts that you can give. And wisdom, share your knowledge. The beauty of our work is the ability to share the wisdom and knowledge we have, that each of us have. We've gained wisdom from our own experiences, from our own schooling or teachings that from our own environment that we've grown up in or that we live in. Share your knowledge from your past experiences. And when you share your knowledge, this can be highly valuable for the participants. But again, you want to do it in a kind and gentle way. You don't want to be overbearing, and you don't want to make your discussion with them about you. You want to make sure you're making it about them.
And I think the good, the beauty of transitional housing is that supportive services, so you're supporting them along their way of their journey and their story right now. So you're supporting them in all of those ways, and it could be a loving way, an honest way. So you are providing those supportive services, and I think that that's going to deeply impact just how well they feel about themselves and empowerment and successful, for them and what they see as being successful and happy in the future. I think that helps guide them to that. And I think that's really what we hope to do, to guide them, not offer, our resources as being the best, but just offering them and, letting them decide for themselves. They are the expert in their own lives. And so I think that if we follow those values and those guides, you really are doing, you're decolonizing your work.
Right. And so and another piece of the cultural supports, we talked a little bit about getting them back into the community. I want to acknowledge first that their safety is most important. So it's important that we are talking about safety with them on a regular basis and that we're revisiting safety with them. Sometimes we know that offenders are allowed to move about within the community. So when they are reaching out for cultural supports, whether it's ceremonies or powwow or maybe language classes. Wintertime is when we share a lot of our stories in our history. Some of those activities that are offered in the community, not only the victim, but the perpetrator may have access to them. So be aware of that, and through the process, through the time that they are in our programs, we have to continuously revisit their safety plans with them. When I talk about safety plans, I mean very basic things as well. So, who are the safe people that they might be able to call? Where might they go if they're in trouble? And what are things that they might need to take with them should they flee? Important documents, bank accounts, birth certificates, that sort of thing. But their safety plans are going to change through this process as well. But one of the things that you can do as a service provider is see if there's anything that you can bring to a safe location for those families that are not feeling safe enough to go out into the community, whether it's sweat lodge, or those sort of things that you might be able to bring to a safe location for them to access, or at a time when it's safe for them to access where other community members might not be participating in it. So knowing who those support people are. So I want to just take a moment, and we've got about 15 minutes left, and I just want to take a break and allow for anyone who has questions to please go ahead and either unmute yourself or type in a question. We'd love to hear from you, some things that you're thinking of or that you might want to share with the rest of the group. So we have oh, what? I'm sorry.
And we know, we just realized that you can't use your phone or can speak, but you can put in the text box anything, questions or comments that you have.
So feel free to step in at any time, and I'm going to go ahead and just continue talking so we can finish up on time. We also have some resources that I want to share with you that have been really, really helpful. So one of the things that we did on a regular basis was in helping participants to access those services was really vital. So I made connections. One of the areas that I worked, I did not, I grew up near there, but I wasn't from that particular tribe. And so I made those connections. I reached out to the elders in the community. I identified the resources that were there and worked with some of the traditional practitioners, the traditional healers and medicine people, so that if we had a participant in our program that needed help, that we were able to access them without going to the community ceremony or the community programs that were being offered. And this was helpful for those participants. We want to recognize that the fundamental principle of the fundamentals are trust building. So making sure that they're able to access those ceremonies, those resources, and continue to be safe within there. We also want to engage in that process of relationship building. So as we work with housing programs, or I can't think of the word, other housing establishments where participants are going to be staying, that we talk to them about safety, that we're maintaining our confidentiality. We have a commitment first and foremost to those participants, that we're maintaining their confidentiality. But as a service provider, we need to be educating them on safety issues or on domestic violence or sexual assault or stalking. So we want to be aware as well, and sharing, strengthening that support for those participants. And so we talked about access to traditional cross-cultural responses. So not only traditional ceremonies, but also churches that are in the area, or other programs that might be an option for our participants so that they have that ability to make choices.
And it's just focusing on that connection with that person. So, just listening to what they seem, what they would like help with for their healing journey. And I think it's also important, especially if you do live in an urban area, it really is important to just do some research on, any American Indian program that you have in your community, to make sure that the spiritual healer or, the medicine man, that they are authentic and
right, and that you can trust them, that they're safe people. Mm-hmm. If you wouldn't go to that person, or you wouldn't send your own child or your own sister to that person for help, you don't want to be referring participants to that person either. And this really is the foundation. Participating in those traditions and those supports is really going to be the foundation for their long-term healing.
And I think that goal, that restoring factor, trauma is in a sense of being out of balance, not living in harmony. So all of these supportive services that transitional housing programs provide, those are stepping stones into restoring that balance and restoring that healing piece. So I think that, participating in activities that are going to be helpful, healing, those are ways in which you're healing, and not forcing it upon. I know some funding you can't force it anyways, but don't force people into going to those things. It's always, we want to protect the sovereignty of program participants. So that's important. I think that's, talking about long-term care is just identifying the autonomy and the sovereignty that you have over yourself, which I think, when you are an abusive, or, when you've had trauma because of domestic violence or abuse or violence, sometimes that autonomy and sovereignty, as we see, can be lost, but it's always found. You're always in charge of yourself. So
yeah, and realizing, I think that's a really strong piece of their healing, is realizing that they have choices as well. Mm-hmm. So a tribal community that operates with integrity shares the responsibility with the community at large. I like that quote. So we carry a duty to each other to restore wellness, not only within ourselves, but help those that we're working with to restore wellness and balance within themselves, as well as the community.
And I think a good quote, before we start into the resources, is just from Loma Mankiller, when she said that we have indigenous solutions to our problems. And I think, that's something to be left with, that we do have value solutions to some of these things. It's just through colonization, sometimes it's been, disrupted, or, with boarding schools, it's really hard to pass those things down. And I think, especially today, we are revitalizing that, and we're decolonizing our communities. So just leave with that quote.
So we have a lot of resources, and I'm going to encourage you to look at our website and redwind.net, and we're always building on that. And actually, we're in the midst of developing a direct service program here in Colorado Springs. So some of our resources, our resource page is expanding nationally and locally here in the Springs. So come back to it as well. But we look at the National Indian Country Clearinghouse on Sexual Assault. That's with Hallie Bonger-White. We have the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. They have a great program. They have several webinars on their website that are recorded. And so you can go to their resource section and check them out and anytime at your convenience. The National Tribal Justice Resource Center, Tribal Courts Clearinghouse, Tribal Order for Protection, National Indian Child Welfare Association. We also have MUSAC, or Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition. They are the tribal TA provider for trafficking and prostitution of Native women. Let's see. We have a National Teen Dating Abuse Hotline. Then, of course, there's the mainstream programs as well that you can access. National Sexual Assault Resource Center and National Domestic Violence Resource Center. We have the Indian Law Resource Center, Native American Jobs, which is HTTP. It's just Native American .jobs. We know that's challenging for participants sometimes, and they don't want to leave a Native community, but maybe they want to relocate to another reservation. The National Congress of American Indians. That's a great resource as well. The National Indigenous Elder Justice Institute. They provide research, education, and training for the identification and prevention of elder abuse in Indigenous communities. And that's just what I would do is just Google. You can Google some of these. National Indigenous Elders Institute. Native Out. That empowers Indigenous LGBTQ or two-spirited people. United Native American Housing. And then we have tribal coalitions. There's about 18 of them. And those you can find links on our website and National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. But the tribal coalitions focus on domestic violence and sexual assault. So I want to say thank you very much for your time.
Yes, thank you.
And we appreciate you participating, and know that this is being recorded, and we will be posting it on our website within the next couple weeks. So if you have members of your team or other advocates that want to listen in, they can do so at that time. So thank you so much and have a great rest of your day.